Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lesson. We're going to be talking all about skin tones this week. Now, our final project, which we're going to start next week, is going to involve a character. I'm going to have probably two options for you to draw from for that particular character, and you're going to be rendering them out in full value, full color, full texture, but we haven't really talked about the texture of skin tones. And I know a lot of people like drawing and painting characters and want to get better at making their skin tones look more realistic. So I'd say there's three main things that go into skin tones. One is, how does light actually work on skin? What is the texture of skin? After that, we have the more niche subject of subsurface scattering. So we'll be talking about that. That's this effect that's happening right here with these hands. You've probably all experienced this when you were younger. You took a flashlight, stuck your hand over it, and it started glowing red. You're like, ooh, that's such a cool, creepy effect. That's subsurface scattering. And then lastly are the color zones of the face. Particularly with portraiture, this is important, but I think it's just a good concept in general to take note of, because you will see these similar patterns of color apply to other parts of the body, just not with the same amount of predictability as they show up with on the face. So those three things: what is the texture of skin? What is subsurface scattering? What are the color zones of the face? Those are going to help you through, I would say, a good 85 to 90% of any situation in which you would be painting skin. There, I remember when I first took a figure painting class, we had this whole book on mixing skin tone colors and getting like the highlight values and then the shadow values of it, and it was like this little recipes. It's like, oh, you want to paint someone of Asian ethnicity, you use these colors, and that's how you can get their skin. You want to paint someone from African ethnicity and descendants, then you use these colors. You want to paint someone who's European, you use these colors. And there's this little formula. And I guess it's okay. I would say a lot of the paintings that the artist of that book made, they looked a little stiff and dead to me. And that's because it just gave them a start. You still need to put in reflected light. You still need to put in fill light. There's going to be changes based on where the light source is, how intense the light source is. There's just too many variables. You can't come up with a formula for painting. If you could, it would be a lot easier subject to learn. If you could just, click a button, input a few things, and make a formula for it. Wouldn't be nearly as tricky. So I've got an example of some different skin tone swatches here. One that's a little more warm and slightly more towards the yellow oranges. One that's a little more towards red. It's kind of pink. And then two that are a little bit darker. These are just like a desaturated orange and a desaturated red to get those two brownish colors. I think the number one thing I see when people start trying to do skin tones digitally is a lot of people have learned to apply their shadow with multiply. Okay? So they'll put a shadow over their skin tone like this, and then they look and they go, oh no, why doesn't that look like I want it to look? Why does that look kind of dead? And your paintings are going to feel so lifeless, and your figures are going to they're going to look more like plaster casts. And the reason is multiply works great if the object doesn't let any light through. And as I had kind of previewed for you before, the human figure is somewhat translucent. That's how we get this subsurface scattering, which we'll get into a little bit more in a bit here. But because of that, you aren't able to just do something as simple as you would like a concrete wall. This would work well on a concrete wall. It's not going to work well on a human being that's living and breathing. So in order to get these proper shadow colors, how I usually think of it, and I'm going to pull up this example real quick. This is Charles Reed. He was a watercolor painter in the 50s. He may still be be around today. He's one of my favorite watercolorists in terms of figure, even though some of his stuff by today's standards would be a little gimmicky. He likes to do these like splashy things where he just flicks watercolor paint over his figure painting, and I think nowadays a lot of people are just like, no, just let your figure painting speak for itself. Don't toss in any dumb gimmicks like that. But besides that, what I like about him is he has great clarity and good simplification. He also has pretty nice compositions, and his figures aren't too bad either. Let's look at some of the different tones, just color picking off of here. All right. You can see some are similar. Like I would say this one right here and this one right here, they're pretty close. These two are pretty close. These two are pretty close to each other. But most of the other ones have a decent amount of difference to them. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about like seven different distinctive tones just for the skin itself. And that's what that multiply method leaves out. By just going over your shadows like this for your figure, one, the colors look awful because they're very dead. But two, there's nowhere near that complexity and richness that we would be getting from something like this. We have all of this color diversity. So you might be thinking now, okay, great. So you've told me there's a problem, Garrett. Now how do I fix the problem? I already knew there was a problem. I've learned nothing so far. Nothing. This lecture's been a waste. So how do you start applying this? You start applying it by oversaturating the shadow. So I would drop this down and turn up the saturation in the shadow area. So if it's this very neutral pink color right now, I'm going to go down and over in saturation. Then, to make it even more complex, I'm going to shift the hue. So I'm going to slide parts of it over more towards pink. Same thing up here. I'm going to have some slight variation in that skin tone up on the top. And with all these things working together, we get much closer to what that skin tone should be looking like, what this should actually look like. So that would be rule number 1. Keep your shadows saturated. That's the problem with this multiply method right here. It's completely desaturated. There's no life in there, no saturation. Where this saturation is coming from, it's mostly coming from the blood and the color of our tissue, this like pink color of our tissue. As the light bounces around and in it and through it, it's reflecting that color back to us. Let's drop to another skin tone. Let's try this out again. What about this one? Okay, it's a little more in the yellow-orange, but we can still use that same principle. You can see pretty different tonally. We can slide this over a little bit more towards red. There we go. Now we got some variation in the hue, and then maybe a little bit of value difference in the light part of the skin. You don't need to worry about copying this skin tone swatch. If you want to like run a little test yourself while I'm going over this, you can feel free to, but you don't need to be copying this part. There's only going to be one exercise for today. For this one, same thing, a little darker, a little more saturated. And then I'm going to cool it off slightly. So push it a little more towards red just to get some differences in the hue. Slight difference in value on the top. push the value even more with that hue difference. And the last one, I have to go even more saturated with this. There we go. Okay, so for this last tone, I was going about the same saturation as I would normally do, and it wasn't enough. I needed to go a lot more saturated than I was expecting in order to get the correct tone there. All right, and then let's cool this off a little bit more. You got kind of this like purpley color there. I think I've got a little too much opacity on this. And soften it up. So that same color, you want to really increase saturation. You want to vary the hue often. Let's go back to this image, this Charles Reed one, and let's keep analyzing. What are some of these lights and colors that we're seeing here? All right, so on the arm, very saturated in terms of the color. It's a pretty bright orange color that's existing right there. Versus if we look down here, it's getting a little more neutral. This is a little more neutral, a little more desaturated. So why is this so dark and so saturated? Part of it is because the arm, if we were to envision this as like a plank, is making this shape. Okay? And the shadow is pointing straight down. And this side is pointing in, and we have the head blocking a lot of light that would be coming in from this side of the figure. Versus the back, this is just one plane, and we have lots of open area for light to enter and start filling up that shadow. And that's actually why this bottom portion, oops, oh no, I drew it on the same layer. Let's hope I have enough undo states here. Okay, good. That's why this bottom area has this blue in it. That's fill light from the sky hitting the back of that shadow. So it lightens the shadow, it also cools it off. Okay, so what's happening right here? We were talking about this earlier. We know it's more blocked off, so that explains why it's darker. But why is it more saturated in its value? Well, the reason for that is because when light hits the figure, why isn't it? Oh. Sorry, having technical issues here. Layers popping below stuff. Drawing on the wrong layer. Get it together, Garrett. Get it together here. When light is bouncing off the figure, it is going to be sending bounce light from this peachy orange skin tone back into the shadow. And you're kind of seeing it here when you start taking figure painting classes, and I highly recommend you do. You know, there's a lot of fine arts classes that will waste your time. Figure class, assuming like just check out the instructor's work. Like if you see their name, look them up online. If their drawings look halfway decent, then take their class and you will learn a lot from studying the figure about any type of painting. It's just incredibly good practice to have. And part of what you'll notice is when you're painting the figure, how bright some of those reflected lights are in the shadows. Okay? These lights that bounce in there. This feels understated to me. It could probably go even brighter. I've seen some some poses where the light bouncing on the figure, it looks like a neon sign, like those glowing neon tubes. That's what the reflected light looks like. That's how bright and saturated it is. Okay, so that's what's going on here. We've got a darker shadow plus bounce light, creating that more saturated undertone. We've got a little bit of that happening here. What I'm guessing is because this arm is in front of the head, if here's the head, and then we've got this arm cutting in front of the head, you're going to have more light bouncing off the chest underneath and hitting that particular arm. So that's why that's a little bit brighter. And then we have anatomy that's playing into things here. So the scapula, if we were to draw in some anatomy here, it's actually probably shifted more because the arm's higher up. If the scapula is right here, we now have a downward facing plane, and thus this portion of the shadow isn't really getting fill light from the sky. But if we move a little bit over to here, where we're on the trapezius now and it's facing upwards and outwards, we're getting that cool fill light again. Areas like the knees. Why is it a little bit redder up there? Well, for that, we'll come back to this. For that, let's start moving on to the color zones of the face. Right. So this is a simplification to help break down what you should mentally be thinking about in terms of differing the color in different parts of the face. On the forehead, it tends to be more yellow or white. A lot of this is due to the fact that your hair covers your forehead, so it's not exposed to nearly as much sun. There's also not a ton of musculature or blood vessels up there, so you're not having a lot of blood running through it. Versus the nose, the sinuses have a ton of blood. That's because when you breathe in, your sinuses are also helping you oxygenate. Your cheeks, they have a lot of blood. Like for whatever reason you want to hypothesize. Whatever reason you want to hypothesize why, humans do signal to each other socially through their cheek color. Like you can tell when someone's really embarrassed or if someone's really angry or kind of like emotional or sad, they start getting very flushed cheeks. And then down here in the jaw and the chin, it tends to be a little more blue-green or gray. And this one, I'd say, is more obvious in men. With women, you don't usually see this as strongly. For men, the reason is very simple, and that is that majority of men will have some type of facial hair. And those hairs, those hair follicles, are going to be pushing up on the skin, okay? And they'll be separating it from a lot of the tissue and blood vessels below. So that already is making the skin look a little lighter. And then the hairs are usually cooler. Like most hairs are going to be either black or brown and maybe like blonde, which is usually kind of clearish anyways. It'd be interesting though on a red, like someone with a red beard. I don't know if this effect would be the same. Yeah, like red stubble. But that's what's going to give that effect, is the hair follicles down here are going to make it look like this. Now, on a female figure where they don't have like a big Viking beard, you will still get a somewhat similar but more understated result because of the skin being pulled very tightly against the jawbone. Trying to think of other reasons why it would be like that. There are some veins, and as you've probably noticed in your life, veins are a little more green or blue because they have deoxygenated blood that's going back to the heart. So could be that. Sometimes that affects the color of the veins underneath the skin. But I would say it's mostly just due to the fact there's not as much tissue and the skin is being pulled fairly taut over those bones there, versus like the cheeks have a little bit of meat to them. The nose has quite a bit of cartilage built up on it. Even the brow has like a pretty good amount of muscle built up to it. But the chin area doesn't really have that much. So let's look at this guy. You can really clearly see the red here in the cheeks and a little bit on the nose, and you can see how the forehead's a little more yellow and light. This George Washington portrait, he woke up early. He put on some nice rouge to impress the other patriots during the Revolution. Either that, or he had a horrible drinking problem. I'm not sure. It's a lot of rosacea there, but very red, rosy cheeks, and then a more yellow forehead. And if we look right here above the lip, see how there's more purple? And down here near the chin, see how that's getting more purple in comparison to the nose and the cheeks? Look at this portrait from Sargent. This one's a little trickier now, isn't it? We can kind of see a fair indication of pink. And then as we get near the mouth, this is a little more blue. Down here, it's a little more blue-green, but it's really subtle. Like George Washington, it's like, boom, just put a stem on that. You've got an apple or a cherry. I forget which one, which tree he had. I think he had cherry trees. Put a little stem on his cheek. It's a cherry. If we move over to this girl, that's barely pink. There's more pink sort of underneath the eyelid from the bounce light coming off of her cheekbone than there is on the cheek itself. And her hair is covering up most of her forehead. So maybe we get a little sliver of light right there that's more of that yellow color, but it's not as clear. But it's still there. It's present, but it's subtle. This, I think, is a more clear example again. Very yellow for the forehead, very red for the cheeks and the nose, and then we're sort of losing that neutral or cooler color. We get a little bit of purple here, maybe a little bit on the upper lip. We're seeing some more grayish blue colors. But in comparison, like if you were to look at this and I were to ask you, which one of these is more red? Is option 1 more red or is option 2 more red? You could really easily tell me, you're like, oh yeah, option 2. Option 2, no worries. 2 is the red one. And that's what you want to have come across in your skin tones. You want to make sure that you've just made the red a little bit more stated. You've made this slightly more yellow, and then that neutral color will probably fall right into place. So now jumping back to here, when we were talking about all the color differences. We talked about the bounce light. We talked about the fill light. Why is the knee this color? Similar reasons as to the face. As we get closer to the knee, we're going to get more tissue. So the knee has a lot of tissue that builds up to protect the bones underneath, and it also has to stretch a great amount. So because of that tissue buildup here and that stretchiness, it's going to become a little more red. It could also just be that like the skin there is slightly darker as well. I'm not sure how much of it's blood and how much of it's just like skin that's a slightly different color or a little bit thicker. So that is going to be a little bit more red and dark. Same thing with the elbows. They're going to be a little more red and dark. When you move to the extremities, the hands and feet, they're also going to be a little bit darker. In modern society, since most of us hopefully wear clothes out and about, you're going to have a lot of your figure covered most of the time. You're going to have a shirt on, you're going to have pants on or shorts. So all of that skin in that area isn't really going to be exposed to the light. And over years of buildup, or if you just work outside for one summer, you get the dreaded farmer's tan, where you've got really tan arms from here down, and then it's like very light colored skin from there back. So that's also what tends to create that gradient, just exposure to the light. So a little bit darker on the hands and then lighter as you go in. People's stomachs and backs tend to be the lightest. Now this obviously changes if people go out tanning and sunbathing frequently, but like the back in general and the stomach in general tend to be pretty light, and then it just gradates darker from there as you get to the limbs. So that's what's also helping to create all of this complexity in the color. I'm jumping back here one more time. This just doesn't cut it. And you can kind of see now, after we've talked about all that, it's almost laughable to think that, like, oh yeah, you can make an accurate skin tone and get good shadows just by putting a multiply layer. You can see how complex it is, how much goes into it. Like all the complexities of lighting we've been talking about, and then anatomy layered on top of that, how human physiology works. That plays a big part into what skin tones look like, because we're more complicated than a red plastic bucket. That'd be easy to paint, or a sphere. You just have a green sphere and you're lighting that. That's pretty predictable. But with the figure, it's like 30 of those spheres, and they all have slightly different attributes to them. So that stuff's kind of hard to remember. And I think really to ingrain this, you're going to need like a semester-long class of painting the figure. Or you would need to take a while just yourself practicing painting the figure and making note of this stuff. So the simple rules to remember is that you just need to have more saturated shadows. You need to have a good variety of tones, so lots of difference between the hues. And then when it comes to the portraits, this general color breakdown, yellow, red, blue, primary colors, easy to remember. Yellow for the forehead, red for the cheeks, blue for the jaw. That will help you to get that accuracy in the face. All right, let's talk about one last thing here, and that's going to be subsurface scattering. So what is happening with this? What is going on with this brightly glowing hand? Well, the reason why our hands do this is because if we were to do a texture study, skin is very similar to the gummy texture that we did, except it's a little more opaque, so that when you don't have a very strong light, it's not going to have enough intensity to penetrate into the skin and bounce around and cause this glowing effect. But when you have a flashlight, so if we had the light painted in here, when you have something like this really bright light, and it's only a couple inches away, it's a very powerful light source, and thus it has enough energy to penetrate into the skin and bounce around. And that's that glow that we're seeing. It's light, soft light, bouncing around inside of the fingers here. You'll notice too, look at this part right here. Look at this little dark line. Why is it doing that? Okay. It's very similar to if we were to do a gummy cylinder. Remember on the gummy sphere, it was darker near the edges? Well, gummy cylinder would probably take on the same properties. It'd be darker near the edges, and then it would be brighter in the middle. And it's the exact same thing that's happening with that finger right there. An important note with subsurface scattering, let me pop back to James Gurney's diagram here. You're usually only going to see it on a person when the light is behind them. And he has a really nice example here. He has a plastic cow, so something that doesn't let any light through. And then he has this orange slice, and the orange is very similar to our tissue, probably a little more transparent. But then when we flip the lighting around, where now the light source is behind the orange, you can see how much it's glowing because of all that light entering the orange and bouncing around. Yet the cow is really dark. It's exactly like that multiply layer problem I was showing. It works on the cow. That is what the cow would look like, but it's not what the orange would look like. So lastly, to wrap this up before we start our exercise, why are the shadows on people a little more saturated? It's because there's more light bouncing in our skin and bouncing around and then coming out and reflecting back to the eye. So that is going to lighten it up a little bit. There's going to be a slight glow in the shadows themselves. All right, and with that, I think we have enough to get going. You're really only gonna ingrain this stuff by seeing it and practicing it. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing some paintings. We're going to do one today. So this would be the Monday section. And then you're going to do another one on Wednesday. I'm going to demo this one. And then the Wednesday one will be up to you. Okay, so you'll have my notes to help follow along. And then Wednesday, I want you to try and, remember what was being talked about today and see how far you can get with that. All right, I'm going to start this in just a second. I need to grab a little bit more water, and I'll be right back. So you can just skip ahead once you see me starting to paint. I'll be right back. All right, and I'm back. So what I'll be doing first with this, as we've talked about this semester, color is relative. The surrounding colors greatly affect what it is we're going to be seeing and perceiving in the painting. So just getting some of that in there. This artist has put like a colored ground. So we've got this bright pinky purple color scumbled underneath. So I'm just going to toss a little bit of that in there. With this section too, you don't need to watch this. Like, feel free to have it on as you're painting. I'll be tossing out some notes on it, but you don't need to sit through, watch the whole thing, and then start doing it yourself. You can just immediately dive into the painting portion. But if this helps you to get started and give you an idea of what you should be looking for, then by all means, watch as long as you would like. Just want to make sure if people are ready, they don't feel that they're being held back by the pacing. Oops. I'm blocking in some of these bigger tones first, even though this is just a study. It's helpful to get a rough block in for the color, and then start adding in more of the tighter details on top of this. It'll make a lot of the trickier colors. Keep doing that. There we go. The colors that are harder to figure out, it'll make that a little easier. It'll also make the painting feel resolved quicker. So with just that, we're already a good chunk into finishing this up. I like to have my reference in view at the same time. So I'm going to be darkening this up a little bit. Oops. I'll do that. There we go. All right. I'm just going to extend out my canvas a little more. I'll crop it back in later. At this point, I'm also going to jump on top of the line work. So before I was painting underneath the line work really loose, and now I'm going to jump on top of the line work because I want to start slowly getting rid of that. I'm going to stay fairly zoomed out. I'll probably paint at this distance for the majority of the painting. You don't want to zoom in and start messing around with little tiny details. That's going to be pretty time consuming, and it's not going to help you get the overall color. All right, here's an interesting thing that's happening. Talking about color notes here. Why is the edge of this shadow so bright and saturated? Why is it so bright right here? My guess would be that it's because this form is rounding. The cheekbone is rounding over. And because of that, if we envision this as like a cylinder here, if we have really bright light, there's going to be light bouncing around inside of the cylindrical form, causing that glow on the other side, that subsurface scattering. So that would be my guess. This other stuff's pretty easy to figure out. Reflected light on the top of the brow, reflected light on the bottom of the nose, reflected light on the underside of the chin, and then look at that beautiful fill light, that cool blue on the forehead and the nose and the chin. So it really makes it feel kind of outdoorsy. This really nice natural light is all of that interaction, that complex lighting interaction of light from the sky and light from the reflections of the figure. though I'm doing these smaller areas, I'm still trying not to zoom in, not to get too caught up in tiny details. We're studying color here. We're not trying to render a hyper realistic form. So keep the focus on that, just these bigger blocks of color. Oh, it's all a mess now. I'm just gonna flatten it all down. I'd like bits of the painting on all different layers. Locking it probably would have been helpful, but it's just a study. It's okay. Switching over to the mixer brush now, just to get some of these soft transitions. I've got most of the big movements in there. Now it's time just to get some of these smaller, more subtle transitions. Some nice ones up here in the hair. And I'm looking at the painting, and then I'm also remembering what I know about the figure. Okay? That rounder forms are going to have a softer transition. The cast shadows from other objects, that's going to have a sharper transition. So it's a combination of looking at the painting that I'm copying, and then also remembering what I've learned from my own painting experience and painting figure and all of that. There we go. Something was feeling a little bit off, and it's these white clouds in the background. They were missing. They're going to help add some, again, color context to all of this. And I think there's a little bit more to go. Spend some time, really make sure that I'm getting all of these different sophisticated color areas, really like looking and observing and thinking about what this stuff is like. What's this blue thing doing here? This little blue bit of paint. Why is that there? What purpose is it serving, both in terms of anatomy and then what's happening in terms of color? Is this an artistic choice? Is this observation of anatomy? Or is this an observation of light and how substances are reacting? Like also this bright green in here too. A little pop of bright green right there and right there. It's like a hidden complementary color, this peachy, reddish tone, and then that green. I really love this particular area, that periwinkle color. It's right here. Oh, so beautiful. There's this little perfect triangle of really beautiful color that also relates to the real world. Look at that bright red there too. These are color choices that you are only going to find from studying other painters. And this artist, Jamie Jones, he's done that a lot. He's done a lot of study of other painters that he considers better than him, and learning from them and figuring out what exactly makes their work so entrancing. Yeah, so with this type of stuff, I'm never in a rush with it. Like I'm just moving through and like kind of looking, and then I try and think about it as well. So more than just copy and move on. Copy and think, why is that color there? There was a figure drawing instructor that I did like a summer workshop thing with, and he had an exercise where you could only draw for like 4 minutes, and then he would set a timer for a separate 4 minutes where all you could do was stand back and look at your drawing and look at the model. And it really forced you to observe, and that 4 minutes you got in your drawing, like that time that you had to actually draw the figure, was so much more fruitful because you weren't just guessing. So much of the times when we're painting and we're drawing, we're just like nervously scratching the canvas, you know, hoping that these random clunky lines we're putting down and little blobs of paint will hopefully make a beautiful image. And I mean, very rarely will you get a beautiful result from that. Sometimes you get your Bob Ross moment, you get your happy little accident, and you get a really cool thing, but you're training to be a professional, at least most of you are. You don't want to rely on dumb luck for your job security. When you're told, like, hey, we need you to perform, we need you to do this thing, and you're like, okay, roll this pair of dice. Hopefully you get a really high number, and that means that I'll be able to actually accomplish what I need to do today. No one's going to want to work with that. It's too unpredictable. So as painters, we need to figure out how can we build up a knowledge base to draw from, and then what are some reliable systems that I can lean upon to actually start building up a painting. I'm just taking some time to look to see what else I could improve here. What does my piece look like? What does the original look like? What's missing? One thing I can see is that the top of the head here, there's some lighter pink tones mixed in with this hair. Some warmer colors. That white goes down a little bit more than where I had it. And then there's this like fuzzy bloom on the top of the head right there. This skin tone on the neck's a little darker than what I had. Bring that back, darken that up, soften that up. Yeah, this is definitely more saturated here. I got a little too much of that pink color on the cheek. Let's push that back. Pause and take a look at this again after making that second wave of adjustments. Seeing there's a little bit of light popping up right there. Same thing with the band there. Okay, that's helping to define the form on the top of the head. Other than that, I think it's looking pretty good. So I'll probably wrap it up right about here. So this is all we're doing for Monday. Just take your time, really dig into looking and observing the shapes and the colors. Think about why there's this particular color on the forehead. Where are these warmer lights coming from? Look at all the variations in the skin tone. And that's how you can create really nice, rich complexity within the colors of the skin tone itself. And most people do okay with the rendering. Like honestly, most people can blend out some smoother transitions for cheeks and like sharper areas for musculature, but it's color where I see most people's work fall flat when it comes to the figure. So this is what you'll be working on for today's class. And then on Wednesday, we pop back one folder, you're going to do one more study of this figure. So I'll have a Procreate version, and then I'll have a Photoshop version. But this is the drawing that I'm going to give you. So you can see it's not the full figure. It's just the hands and the face. So if we pop back here, it's just zooming in on this area. So look at those color zones. Okay? Yellow for the forehead, more reddish in the cheeks, and then we get more blues around the chin. Look at the hand. See the blue on the back of the hand? If you look at your hands, you can kind of see some blue veins, bluish green veins underneath there. So that's where that's coming from. The knuckles, there's more skin and tissue there. So they tend to have a little more color than other parts of it. You can see that gradient. Look at how the hand is darker, and then we get up to the arm and it starts to lighten up. But look at how the arm is a little darker than areas like the leg and the thigh. This artist is Jeremy Lipking, and he's a contemporary oil painter. And he primarily focuses with, excuse me, primarily focuses with figures for his subject. But he's got beautiful brushwork. Try and ignore some of the highlights coming off of the oil paint. That's not really part of the painting. That's just coming from the camera that's photographing it. But this will be your second painting. And do this one second because it's trickier. Okay, this first one, Jamie Jones's, very clear. Pretty broad shapes cut into the forms. This one, the shapes are a lot more smoother, blended together, and the colors are a lot more subtle. All right, so that's your assignment. You're going to be copying these two paintings pretty much exactly like what I was doing here with this one. I would set a timer no more than 2 hours on each of these. If you're going over 2 hours, you should have the whole thing blocked in 2 hours. Like if you notice the color block in I did, that only took maybe 5 minutes. That should go fairly quickly, just underneath the line art, blocking all the colors. But then the rendering portion of it, where you're getting more specific with all the shapes and details, that, cut it off after 2 hours. I think most people will finish before then, but just in case it's going a little long, make sure to put a timer on yourself. Probably set a timer for an hour. After an hour, then maybe take a break from it, come back a little bit later, and then work on it a little bit more. That'll help you get out of some ruts you might have fallen into, and you'll be able to see your work a little more clearly. Okay, so that's it for this week, and then next week we're going to be moving on to the final, and that'll be it. We'll be wrapping up the semester with that. So let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you guys next week. All right, bye for now.